In 1984, a political scientist named Philip Tetlock began a 20-year study. He recruited 284 experts, political scientists, economists, area specialists, intelligence analysts, and asked them to make predictions about political and economic events in their domains of expertise. Over the following 2 decades, he collected approximately 80,000 forecasts and tracked their accuracy against what actually happened. The results were published in 2005 in a book called Expert Political Judgment. The finding was arresting. The experts, on average, performed only slightly better than random chance at predicting outcomes in their own domains of expertise. A simple rule: assume the future will look like the recent past. Outperformed the expert predictions in many categories, and the experts who expressed the most confident predictions were, on average, less accurate than the experts who expressed greater uncertainty. This finding has been widely cited. It has also been widely misunderstood in a specific way that this episode tries to address. The finding is not that experts know nothing. The finding is more specific, that the type of expertise that produces a confident prediction, depth of domain knowledge, ideological coherence, a clearly articulated theory, is not the type of expertise that produces accurate predictions. The experts who performed best in Tetlock's study were not the ones with the most coherent frameworks. They were the ones who were most willing to say, "I'm not sure," and who drew on multiple frameworks rather than one. Tetlock called the high-performing forecasters foxes, drawing on a distinction originally made by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who know many things. The low-performing forecasters were hedgehogs, who know one big thing. The hedgehogs were more confident. They gave better interviews. Their explanations were more satisfying. They were worse predictors. The hedgehog problem, the inverse relationship between explanatory coherence and predictive accuracy, has a structural basis that is worth understanding precisely. A deep expert in a domain has accumulated extensive knowledge about how that domain has worked in the past. That knowledge is real and valuable for understanding prior outcomes. It becomes a liability in forecasting when the accumulated patterns create an implicit model that the expert applies to new situations, an implicit model that generates confident predictions because the model is internally coherent, and that generates confident wrong predictions when the current situation deviates from the historical patterns the model was built on. The economic expert who confidently predicts that the current economic situation will resolve like the previous 3 similar situations is applying a pattern that is real. The pattern is also not a guarantee. It is a description of what happened in 3 cases, not a law of how economies work. But the confidence the pattern produces feels, from the inside, like the confidence of knowledge rather than the confidence of a heuristic. This is the specific mechanism by which experts consistently underestimate what they don't know. The very process that generates expertise, deep immersion in a domain, strong pattern recognition, a coherent framework for interpreting events, also generates a specific blind spot in the direction of what the framework doesn't cover. The more coherent the framework, the harder it is to see around it. And the harder it is to see around it, the more confidently the expert applies it to situations where it may not apply. Tetlock found something else in his data that receives less attention than the hedgehog-fox finding. The experts who performed best were also the ones who were quickest to update their predictions when new information arrived. Not the ones who had the best initial predictions, but the ones who were most responsive to evidence that their initial predictions were wrong. Have you ever watched an expert resist updating a confident prediction in the face of clear evidence that the prediction was not tracking reality? Leave a comment. The second iteration of Tetlock's work, the Good Judgment Project, launched in 2011, took the foxes further. Tetlock and his collaborators recruited a much larger population of forecasters and trained a subset of them in the specific practices that distinguish the most accurate forecasters from the rest, thinking in terms of base rates before applying specific knowledge, breaking large, uncertain questions into smaller, more tractable components, updating beliefs in proportion to evidence rather than binary confirmation or rejection, and maintaining calibrated uncertainty, expressing more confidence when more evidence supports a view, less confidence when it doesn't. The trained group outperformed not just the average forecaster, but the intelligence community analysts who were working with access to classified information. Tetlock's term for the top forecasters in this group, superforecasters, has become widely used, sometimes accurately. What the superforecaster research identifies is not a type of person, but a set of practices. The practices can be learned. They are not the practices that produce confident, quotable expert predictions. They are the practices that produce accurate ones, and the two are, in many domains, in direct tension. The financial commentator who says, "I expect the market to rise 12% over the next 12 months, is giving a precise, quotable forecast. The superforecaster who says, "I'd put 45% probability on the market being up more than 10%, 30% probability on it being up between 0% and 10%, and 25% probability on it being down," is giving an accurate representation of uncertainty and is less useful for a news segment than the first expert, and therefore less likely to be the one asked. The media and organizational incentives around expert forecasting systematically reward confident prediction and systematically penalize calibrated uncertainty, which means the experts who receive the most attention and organizational authority are, in Tetlock's data, precisely the ones whose forecasts are least accurate. If the specific mechanism, how the incentive structure of expert environments rewards the wrong kind of confidence, is the analysis you come here for, the like is the direct signal. The organizational consequences of the hedgehog problem are specific and visible in the kinds of failures that this channel has examined. Nokia's leadership operated from a coherent framework. Nokia was a hardware company that competed on device quality and variety. That was genuinely successful for most of the company's history. The framework generated confident predictions about competitive dynamics that were wrong about the iPhone, because the iPhone competed on a dimension, software ecosystem, that the framework was not designed to assess. Enron's leadership operated from a coherent framework. Markets for any commodity can be made more efficient through financial engineering that was genuinely insightful in several applications. The framework generated confident predictions about the energy trading and broadband businesses that were wrong, about the speed of market development and the depth of liquidity available. The financial models that failed in 2008 operated from a coherent framework. Historically observed correlations between instruments represent the relationships those instruments will maintain. That was accurate for most of the historical period the models covered. The framework generated confident predictions about risk that were wrong about the tail event conditions, where the correlations that the models assumed changed simultaneously. In each case, the failure was not the absence of expertise. It was the presence of a framework coherent enough to generate confident predictions in the domains it covered, and not covering the domain where the specific failure occurred. The practical response to the expert overconfidence problem at the individual and organizational level is less comfortable than the finding that produces it. The finding suggests that the experts most worth listening to are the ones who are most uncertain, most willing to express that uncertainty, and most responsive to evidence that their initial position was wrong. These are not, in most organizational settings, the experts who receive the most attention or authority. The organizational response requires building in structures that force the most confident experts to express their predictions in probabilistic terms. Not, "this will happen," but, I believe this will happen with X% probability, and here are the specific conditions under which I would update that probability. This makes the confidence visible in a form that can be tracked, updated, and evaluated against outcomes. It makes it harder to maintain a wrong prediction without acknowledging that the evidence is not tracking the prediction. It also requires deliberately seeking out the experts who are confident about what they don't know, not the ones who are confident about what they do know. The expert who says, "I'm confident about the historical patterns here, and I'm genuinely uncertain about how the current situation deviates from those patterns," is the expert whose uncertainty is calibrated to reality. The expert who has a coherent explanation for everything is the expert whose framework may be generating confidence beyond what the evidence supports. The next episode looks at a specific planning failure that is the organizational expression of this same problem. A failure not of knowledge, but of the relationship between what a plan assumes it knows and what it acknowledges it doesn't. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.